Aircraft are complex machines. Over a century of human ingenuity and innovation has pushed aviation to the point where hundreds of passengers can be transported through the skies in a metal tube. Getting a plane off the ground is a delicate procedure that requires pilots to run through several checklists. Attention to detail is key as pilots configure their aircraft to take to the skies. On August 20th, 2008, the pilots of one aircraft struggled to get their plane off the ground. For only after a few moments in the air, the plane crashed, killing 154 people. What went wrong on board Spanair Flight 5022? On August 20th, 2008, this Spanair flight had left the Catalonia city of Barcelona at 8:55 in the morning. The plane is flying a trip to the island of Gran Canaria off the coast of Africa. However, the plane is scheduled to make a stopover in Madrid. The plane is a McDonnell Douglas MD-80. The aircraft is highly popular with pilots and the flying public alike. The sleek rear-mounted engine plane has been a workhorse in Europe, having served for many of the continent's best airlines. In 2008, many airlines had retired the type, however the Spanish airline Spanair still operated the plane in their fleet. Spanair as an airline was formed in 1986. The airline grew to be one of the biggest in the country, with hubs in Barcelona, Madrid, Palma, and Tenerife. Spanair operated 3 different types of the MD-80. However, on today's flight, Flight 5022, the plane is a McDonnell Douglas MD-82. The plane has also been painted in the livery of Star Alliance. The airline had joined the global group of airlines in 2003. This very plane was built in 1993, and Spanair had taken ownership of it in 1999. The Spanair plane had arrived in Madrid at 10:13 a.m. The plane is taxied into Terminal 2 at Madrid Barajas Airport, one of the largest airports in the world. Flight 5022 is to take on more passengers for the trip. It is also a very hot day in Madrid. Summers here can often exceed 40 degrees Celsius at times. Some of the new passengers that were expected to get on the plane in Madrid didn't make it to the gate in time for departure. One of these passengers notably included electronic dance musician deadmau5. He missed the plane, although his anecdote has led to some people thinking he may have been mistaken. Flight 5022 will be flown by 39-year-old Captain Antonio Garcia Luna and 31-year-old First Officer Francisco Javier Mulet. Captain Garcia Luna did his flight training on the MD-80 in the United States at the Delta Airlines pilot training in Atlanta, Georgia. He had also previously flown in the Spanish Air Force and had often flown the Spanish-built aircraft the Casa 212. First Officer Mulet struggled to get a job in the aviation industry, having completed his flight training in 2001. He only got a job at Spanair in 2007. He had less than 500 total hours flying time. Flight 5022 is scheduled to leave the gate in Madrid at 1 p.m, however they are running behind. At 1:06, the crew contact the tower for clearance to start up the engines. Spanair Flight 5022 eventually left the stand at just before 1:20 p.m. and began to taxi out to runway 36 left. Everything was running normally in this departure process until Captain Garcia Luna had to abandon the takeoff. He noticed that the RAM air temperature display was showing a considerably high reading. This abnormally high reading was coming from the RAM air temperature probe. This simple probe measures air temperature and is sometimes known as total air temperature. It is usual that jet planes can have a RAM air temperature reading up to 30 degrees higher than the outside air temperature. The display on Flight 5022 had shown a temperature reading of 56 degrees Celsius that kept climbing until it reached 104 degrees. The reading had alarmed the captain enough that he called off the takeoff. It was shown in the accident report of Flight 5022 that over the previous 2 days there had been multiple instances of excessively high RAM air temperature probe heat warnings on this plane. In these instances, the plane had simply flown with these high readings. Flight 5022 was authorized to then exit the runway, and Captain Garcia Luna had decided to call the Spanair Maintenance Control Center on his mobile telephone for additional guidance. The Maintenance Control Center staff had told the captain to reset the relevant circuit breakers, to which the captain replied he had already previously done. At 1:33 p.m, the plane returned to the apron and a visual inspection of the probe had shown no abnormalities. The cockpit voice recorder had recorded a conversation in the cockpit between the pilots and ground maintenance. They had the idea of using dry ice on the probe to cool the temperature reading. The crew then checked the aircraft's minimum equipment list, which stated that the plane could fly with a malfunctioning RAM air temperature probe so long as no icing conditions had been forecast. The circuit breaker relating to the probe had then been pulled and labelled as inoperative. The relevant notes had been made in the plane's logbook and the maintenance crew had left the plane. It was decided that the plane would now continue to Gran Canaria with this piece of malfunctioning equipment not in use. The inside temperature of the cabin was sweltering. The purser on board had came to the captain and commented on just how hot it was in the cabin. This was because they turned off the engines once they returned to the apron, meaning that the air conditioning was also switched off. The plane had now been delayed on the ground for a further 30 minutes up to this point. During the delay, extra fuel was also taken on board. Eventually, at 2:07 in the afternoon, First Officer Mueller requested clearance to start the engines from air traffic control. However, the transmission was on the wrong frequency. After tuning their radios correctly, the crew received their clearance at 2:08. Within the next few minutes, the crew would make a mistake which would leave them fighting for control of the plane immediately after takeoff. During time on the ground, aircraft flight crews must follow a series of checklists to configure their plane appropriately for takeoff. The crew ran through the pre-start and before-start engine checklists as normal. By 2:12 p.m., both engines had been started and running normally. Once both engines are running, the after-start checklist must now be performed. This checklist contains a series of items which checks to see if varying aircraft systems are functioning as intended. Depending on the checklist, these items can be in a different order. On the Spanair MD-80 checklist, there are a total of 9 items on the after-start list. The last item on that checklist was the check to set the plane's flaps and slats. Flaps and slats are essentially wing extensions which draw outward from the leading edge and trailing edge of a wing. They create a larger physical wing which can generate more lift. Commercial aircraft of all sizes almost always set flaps for takeoff. However, as First Officer Mulet is about to read the flaps call-out, Captain Garcia Luna coincidentally asks for ATC clearance for taxiing out to the runway. The check for flaps and slats was omitted and the crew requested taxi clearance. While waiting for air traffic control to get back to them with their taxi instructions, the crew go over performance data for taking off, discussing the level of thrust needed on this departure. Clearance for taxi was obtained at 2:15, and the plane begins taxiing out to the runway without extending the flaps. During the first departure attempt, the pilots did set the flaps correctly. However, the flaps were retracted once the plane was taxiing back to the apron. The next time the flaps would be mentioned in the checklists would be after the plane is already in the air during the climb checklist to bring the flaps back in. By 2:20, the plane is waiting for takeoff instructions, now holding back on runway 36 left, having now been delayed for over an hour. Flight 5022 is waiting just behind another plane waiting to take off from the same runway. An instruction to taxi onto the runway and hold position is received, and the purser announces to the captain that the cabin is prepared for takeoff. The before takeoff checklist was performed, running through all the items on that list as normal, of which a check for flaps was not noted. At 2:23 p.m, takeoff clearance was received, the brakes were released, and pilots throttled up the plane for takeoff. It should now be noted that even though the pilots have forgotten to set flaps for takeoff, a system had been put into the MD-80 to warn pilots of this error. It's called the Takeoff Warning System, or TOWS for short. This system would provide pilots with an audible warning if their plane was not properly configured for takeoff. This is what the pilots should have heard. The cockpit voice recording revealed that this warning did not sound. The reason as to why this warning system did not sound in the cockpit is complex, so let's break this down a bit and we'll try to keep this simple. To detect whether the plane knows it is on the ground or in the air, the MD-80 uses the plane's own weight to compress a strut in the plane's nose landing gear to close an electrical circuit. This energizes electrical relays which powers on certain aircraft systems. Included in these aircraft systems is the takeoff warning system. When the plane takes off and thus pressure on the nose gear is released, these systems are de-energized as the circuit opens. If a pilot were to take off with the TOWS warning audible, this warning would cease once the plane is in the air. While the crew of Flight 5022 was on the ground in Madrid trying to troubleshoot the issue with the RAM air temperature probe, the electrical current had been interrupted and the TOWS was disabled as if the plane was already in the air, and so it did not sound in the cockpit during takeoff. The crew of Flight 5022 had continued their takeoff without knowing that their plane had not been properly configured. Once the plane had reached takeoff speed, Captain Garcia Luna began to raise the nose of the plane. Very quickly, once the plane left the ground, a stall warning sounded in the flight deck telling the crew that they were about to drop out of the sky. Without the flaps and slats wing extensions, the plane cannot generate enough lift at this speed. The first officer suspected an engine failure. The plane is only at 25 feet above the ground as the plane begins to bank to the right with a nose-up angle of 15.5 degrees. A bank angle warning also sounds in the cockpit. Maximum thrust was applied to the engines, however the plane came back down to the ground with a hard impact as it skidded across the ground away from the runway before it eventually crashed and became engulfed in flames. 18 people survived the crash. 154 people were killed, including all members of the crew on board. The following investigation after the crash was an international effort from the Spanish transport authorities, US National Transportation Safety Board, and Boeing, who assumed the ownership of the MD-80 brand after the demise of the original manufacturer McDonnell Douglas. Multiple theories and speculations quickly sprang up as for the cause of the crash, from the deployment of reverse thrusters to the suspicion of malware having a role in the accident. It was concluded that there were multiple causes to the crash, from mechanical failure from the point of the takeoff warning system being disabled unknowingly, to pilot error on the ground that the pilots did not properly perform the after-start checklist, which included the check for flaps and slats. It was also noted that the crew did not identify the stall warnings when they heard them. In the aftermath of the accident, it was recommended that an amendment to the MD-80 flight manual, under the troubleshooting of the RAM air temperature probe, that a more appropriate set of instructions was needed for pilots. There was also a call to review the TOWS system. The crash of Spanair Flight 5022 was a blow to the operator. Spanair had ceased operations in 2012, following an effort to rebrand the airline after the accident. The accident was the worst air disaster to occur in Spain since 1983. It also had not been the first time an MD-80 had crashed with an improper configuration on takeoff. In August 1987, a Northwest Airlines MD-80 crashed just moments after takeoff from Detroit, Michigan. The crash killed 156 people, leaving one sole survivor. A memorial plaque was set up in Madrid to remember those who died in Spanair Flight 5022. Hello everyone. I'd like to thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. Things have been rather hectic on my end these past few days. The video that should have come out today is currently delayed. My PC had decided to break the other day, and I am currently working on retrieving the video from the hard drive of that PC. Hopefully the video is not lost and you'll see it soon. Thank you all so much for the ongoing support, and now I'd like to take the opportunity to thank my patrons. If you would like to join my Patreon, you can check the pinned comment below. So a thank you to my £5 patrons, D. Rogers, Marie Ennis, KTP123, and Ken Zachman. Thank you all so much, and a very big special thanks to my £10 patrons, Cherub and Side Effect. Thanks to both of you, I greatly appreciate your contribution. Thank you. Thank you once again, and that's it from me for now. I will see you next week. Have a great weekend, and goodbye.